and introduce our discussion on mobilities in African cities. I had the privilege also of engaging Professor Morris over a year ago on the content of this conference, and she asked a number of provocative questions, including, questioning the centrality of the city, even as a way of thinking about contemporary patterns of urbanization. So she plays a very important role in terms of inspiring the content and the conceptualization of the mobility panel. Rosalind Morris is a professor of anthropology at Columbia University, and she focuses her fieldwork in two main areas: Southeast Asia, mainly Thailand, and South Africa. More recently, she has been writing an ethnography of South African mining communities. Her work addresses questions of the relationships between value and violence, aesthetics and the political, the sexualization of power and desire, and the history of anthropological thought and social theory. Please join me in welcoming Rosalind Morris.
Thank you, Umpo. So here we are for part two. I think some of the things that I'm going to say are going to resonate, or I hope they resonate, with the conversations we had this morning. But we begin perhaps with a question. What comes to mind when one thinks of the African city? Lagos, Dakar, Bamako, Johannesburg, Luanda, Nairobi, Kinshasa, Maseru, Harare. These words are, of course, words, but also proper names and signifiers of social worlds, migratory destinations, and points of emigrant departure, phantasmatic landscapes, spaces of living, and spaces of dying. I'm honored to be here and very pleased to be included in the conversation, mainly as someone who listens and learns, in this case, on mobility and the African city today, even if my presence appears like something of an alien invasion. My disciplinary home is located in a building to the north of us here, and it's one that I cannot help but speak from, which is to say, I speak from Anthropology. When Mpo Matsipa and I first spoke about this session, we imagined a double displacement, so to speak. The first displacement would be of the metonymic first city, the capital city and the city of capital, that provides the unconscious referent in most discussions of the city in Africa. I've already given you a list. The second displacement would be of the concept of mobility itself. Both of these displacements would entail resignifications of the problematic to which both theory and practice, architectural practice, urban planning practice, infrastructural development practice, and so forth, devote themselves. So let me begin just very briefly with the first displacement, the city. What if we were to relinquish the very presumption that there is a single social form that could be designated by the singular concept, the city? To think this question would entail not only a pseudo-anthropological pluralization and the specification of regional and cultural traditions within which cities emerge. We would, of course, want to be able to understand how different a city with a millennium-long history as a mercantile center such as Bamako differs from, how that city differs from one invented by mining capital in the late 19th century in a space with no prior population concentrations. And we would want to be able to understand that difference in relationship to another difference, the kind that informs or the kind that can be said to inform the history of a city like Maseru, established near the political center of Moshweshwe's polity, which was nonetheless not a city. But we also need a concept of African cities that fully recognizes the differences between national primate cities and regional or second cities, a differentiation with consequences and not only for social analysis, but for national planning, capital investment, and infrastructural development, among other things. The reason for advocating this is not simply axiomatic. It arises from the fact that natural resource extraction, which plays such an enormous role in Africa, has also generated myriad industrial social worlds that do not correspond to and are not captured by or enabled by in their development by the concepts of the city that arose to understand market and mercantile socialities. So let me move then briefly to the second question, the question of mobility. African literatures of the 20th century are, of course, replete with narratives built around actual movements that are also narratological devices. Chinua Achebe, Ben Okri, Miriam Abba, Amaata Aidu, Njibulo Ndebele, Loretta Nkoba, Yvette Christianse, Zoe Wickham, the list of writers who make travel and migration the medium of their narrative are almost countless. But mobility as a term contains with itself an aspirational and indeed normative dimension that fails to recognize the profound differences between the movement coerced by economic need, political crisis, or social terror, and that enabled by class privilege and liquidity. The migrant without passports, sans papier, or a bank account cannot be understood with the same analytic category as the one with many passports and offshore accounts. These are obvious points, perhaps, but they are often forgotten. More relevant, perhaps, in this context, they are points of departure that may provide awkward entry for this panel, which features three excellent artists, an architect, a designer, and a photographer, whose work is motivated by other questions and who should not be asked to take up the social scientist's concerns. But let me take this aspiration for a double displacement, Mpo's and mine, as the beginning point or the opening for a process of bringing this ambition closer to the terrain of these three speakers. Let me do so through reference to a place that will not register in your imaginations as urban at all, but where the consciousness of being urban constitutes the mode of a desire at once political and affective. This place is Merafong, a municipality in Gauteng province, South Africa, where are located the deepest gold mines in the world. In 2008, an effort by the National Executive Committee of the ruling African National Congress would have redemarcated provincial boundaries such that Merafong would be moved from the jurisdiction of Gauteng into the largely rural Northwest province. Gauteng is, of course, where both Johannesburg and Pretoria are located, and much of finance capital as well. The often violent revolt against this redemarcation generated the first black boycott of the ANC and the closure as well as destruction of many government services and offices, and led to the cessation of all education for nearly 2 years. The language of the revolt was interesting. Residents of the large township said that they were being forcibly relocated, just as their forebears had been forcibly relocated to found the township in 1948 when it was first established, and then again during the period of the Group Areas Act. This forced relocation took place, therefore, in an imaginal domain, but as the expression of a legal violence which was itself a form of political desire on the part of the ANC. No one moved, except the students bused to camps to prepare for matriculation exams because the schools were closed due to boycott. So a question: what does it mean to move, to be moved? What is displacement? This radical practical interrogation of place might be supplemented with an equally radical practical interrogation of population. We know, of course, that informal communities cross the peripheries of even long-lived informal townships, and that even within informal communities there are involuting worlds such that informality accumulates and becomes more and more complex and cannot be said to have a location. But beyond the question of actual bodies, there's the question of who resides there. If, for example, striking mine workers in the same community of Merafong, negotiating with both their unions and mining capital, can say, as they do say, that the force of their words is enhanced by being heard by their deceased parents, if they can say that the source of recognition they seek is not merely from the state and capital, but also from ancestors, we are forced to think about the non-presence of residents who nonetheless live, dwell, and exercise force in these spaces. It goes without saying that all social spaces are spectralized by those who went before and those who have yet to arrive, by both history and futurity, as Mark Wigley said this morning. In our thinking of cities, however, the former is often reduced to questions of ruin or the preservation of tradition. The latter is often contained in the discourse of development and urban planning. Now, the speakers on this panel all work at the limit of these limiting conceptions and discourses. and as I understand and anticipate their papers, of which I've seen only brief descriptions, I gather that they'll address the insufficiencies of the overly binary categories and the essentialist concepts with which we are burdened and which this conference seeks to put in question. And the speakers are Mokena Makeka, Jean Chantal, Mikhail Subrodsky. Mokena Makeka is a designer, and he's not speaking here necessarily in his capacity as designer, but as a theorist of the complex efforts to negotiate tradition and modernity in South Africa today. Jean Chantal is an architect, the founder of one of the most important pedagogical initiatives in the architectural world in Africa. Mikhail Subrodsky is a photographer who, despite his youth, has made a very profound mark on the ways in which we see the invisible worlds that are internal to the cities of South Africa and elsewhere. So I welcome them. We'll begin with Mokena Makeka. Thank you.
Afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much, Rosalind, for a wonderful entry point. I hope we all had a very good lunch. I'll try and get through this as efficiently as possible. There is a desire to map and frame Africa in architectural terms, to give its architectural production attributes which have escaped a colonial orbit. This desire is informed by the necessity, or perceived necessity, to calibrate Africa's contribution to architectural thought beyond the narrow limitations of our assumed past, but to equally recognize the common ground that architecture shares as a cultural discipline confronted by the forces of gravity, climate, and the generic proportions of the average human being. Thus, architecture is both enthralled by the vectors and specificity of place as it is by universal needs. Architecture may be produced by different social and monetary capital flows, proximity and access to materials or markets, but it's also produced by particular agencies and imaginaries of differing competencies and states of self-awareness. Whether the desires that drive these competencies will ever be fulfilled is immaterial. Whether these desires have finite consequences is equally unclear. What is known, however, is that African cities have no choice but to engage with these desires. African cities are and will be amongst the most dynamic and contested spatial conditions on the planet, and the burden of inequality and affirmation of indigenous ascendancy will force various architectural conversations around culture, identity, consumerism to either emerge or submerge, disaggregate, or cohere. In this context, the role of the state of architecture as a site where these conversations are made acute is of interest to me. For it's in the making of institutional architecture that a particular nakedness is revealed, where collisions occur, assumptions are given weight, and meaning is measured. So the corpus of Africa, if we could use such a phrase, elusive, mysterious, complex, aspirant, and fragile in the making, an aggregation of both the familiar and the highly unfamiliar. And with the familiarity, the issue of taste and aesthetic becomes an ontological question that sits above, but often in conversation with traditional architectural morphological concerns. Africa is thus desired, and in many ways is unobtainable, a ghost that whispers sweet nothings in our ears and makes the hair on the back of our necks rise in excitement, but sadly the relationship often cannot be consummated. I have wondered what are the dimensions and operative characteristics of the African city that would mark it distinct from other cities of the South. What attributes would allow us to frame the word city or cityness and Africa incoherent in a continentally unique fashion? What would the uniformities of the African topography be? What would the peaks and troughs in that landscape of being be, and what would be a tolerable standard deviation from that? By and large, Africa is the youngest player in the urbanization game. Many of its cities have been conceived through a geopolitical colonial imagination, which sought to urbanize the local condition to the extent that it facilitated the safe extraction of resources in reasonably familiar settings. Such settings have an aesthetic, political, and social dimension. Demographic change, increasing inequality, resource scarcity, and infrastructure lag are as much African urban problems as they are in Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. And of late, even historically wealthier nations are experiencing similar challenges. So does the geographic territory of Africa offer enough clues to the nature of the African city? It is the oft unstated, subtle subtext of cultural identity and associated practices that could mark this territory. What makes a city African, especially in the context of cities whose colonial descendants occupy the territory, arguably with as much legitimacy as the so-called historically indigenous person? So defining the nature of the African city through its statistical dimensions, in my opinion, reveals nothing of the cultural texture of the African city. Rather, it conceals the palimpsest of particular social imaginaries which are perhaps more fertile ground to mine, so that we can understand the very attributes that we seek to understand, critique, and perhaps reshape. The cultural question, while specific to place and time, offers a unique inflection point in the operation of the city. And when the politics of state and public institutions are deployed in stratagems of national importance, then something more is revealed, presented, and in some instances concealed. The Constitutional Court of South Africa and what we can euphemistically call Nkandla, which is the private residence of the incumbent president of South Africa, are both products of a post-colonial social imaginary in which the question of state institutional performance or aspect and the presencing of Africa are acute, operational, aesthetic, and procedural questions from which the architecture cannot hide. The Constitutional Court precedes Nkandla by a number of years, itself the outcome of an international competition to secure an architect and an architectural vision which would seek to capture the amorphous nature of a post-apartheid identity. The competition was in 1996, South Africa was free in 1994. So South Africans were still grappling with the question of what did it mean to be South African or even African. Located on Braamfontein Hill in the city center of Johannesburg, the site has served as a military fortress, a prison for women, a site of torture, control, and dehumanization, particularly for black people and black males. It was a site which represented the systematic grinding of the autonomy of the African spirit, weighted with the burden of suppressing indigenous identity and the deployment of a different social order which was crystallized in its architectural form. The brief for the competition was both elegant and quite profound. The brief was to create a building rooted in the South African landscape, physically and culturally, without overemphasizing the symbols of any section of the South African population or making a pastiche of them all. The Constitutional Court, in many ways, is the last and probably the first frontier of South Africa's nascent democracy, and it became and probably is the focal point of reconstructing, perhaps even constructing, a South African version of African identity, one which could escape the brutality and morally corrupt nature of the apartheid regime and present to the public a humane, contemporary African face, an identity which hitherto had little architectural shape or precedent. The importance of the architectural edifice would therefore mirror the hard-won achievement of the 1996 Constitution as a social imperative, a constitution which spoke of service, dignity, a constitution that embraced all South Africans as constituents, a constitution which created the framework of a reimagined South Africa, socially, politically, and ethically, to possibly emerge. I would argue that the Constitutional Court therefore becomes an embodiment, an attempt or a practice to try and seize the eclectic nature of South African identity. Its morphological dissonance is quite harmonious, harrowing, but equally pleasing to many South Africans who are its primary audience, and there are a number of architectural devices which contribute to the strategic stratification of the palimpsest of the site. It is not a building where you look on every single elevation and you can understand it. It's a clustering of opportunities, it's a series of plazas, a series of spaces, and in that another story is told. So through the use of art, permeability, austerity, and irony, the stark nature of the social practices are made palpable. The architecture lacks adornment and pomp, but sobriety and joy in a thoughtful manner. The site is a constellation of meaning and gestures which seek to contribute to a broader narrative of the South African city, and its prominence in the city locates its function in distinctly urbane fashion. It is a public building funded by public capital for the public. It is the architectural seat in which public interests find their final arbitration. Thus, in the social cosmology of the city of Johannesburg and the country, it is a beacon unlike any other. In its public aspect, the project invests in a sensibility which locates creativity, hope, and aspiration as a public dimension of being. And I'll just give you some descriptions of the building taken from the website. The building is noted for its transparency and entrancing volumes. In contrast to most courts, it is welcoming rather than forbidding, filled with sparkle and warmth. It has no marble cladding or wooden paneling, but has come to be admired for its graceful proportions. And the principal materials, timber, concrete, glass, steel, and black slate, infuse the court with an African feel. The project is thus a polemic exercise in the role of public architecture in shaping the memory of the city and a country, and eschews any easily read spatial archetypes for justice, order, or civic architecture. The conflation of public and private and the deployment of state resources, however, have been central to what has been a 7-year itch for South Africa, specifically in reference to the establishment of the sometimes private and sometimes official residence of the incumbent state president, Jacob Zuma. In May 9, 2009, Jacob Zuma was sworn in as president of South Africa, but by May 19th, the first security assessment of his private homestead was undertaken, culminating into a very groundbreaking recent constitutional court judgment. Argued as an official residence by various state officials, indeed a national strategic asset, Nkandla becomes important precisely because it inadvertently frames itself as a public building, and so we have to interrogate it for its public role. In the same breath, those very same advocates held it as a private residence and that the dignity of the president must be preserved. The Speaker of the Parliament, a prominent female patriarch, said, "A lot has been clarified, in fact, by the Public Protector's report." She goes on to say a few things which, in our view, are actually debatable, because in the African tradition, you don't interfere with a man's kraal. The issue of a man's kraal is a holy place. A kraal is a corral where you keep your cattle. So unlike the Constitutional Court, which emerged out of a competitive process, the project architect who was appointed had a linear and historic relationship to its patron, was not selected by the Department of Public Works. The extent of the development sets a new precedent for South African presidential buildings for a number of reasons. The project is located in a semi-rural town called Nkandla in the Midlands of Natal, a site which saw incredible violence during the height of the struggle of the 1980s. Now, beyond the privatization of the public through various safety concerns, the architectural language and project components, which are palatial in its African aspect, its organizational language seeks to mimic that of an Nguni monarch or chief, Nguni being Zulu. So from an aesthetic perspective, the Nkandla homestead is a conscious manifestation of a masculine Africanist tradition, supported through programmatic devices which support its polygamous lifestyle, such as discrete love tunnels, bunkers, as well as the cattle enclosure, which are critical to the prestige of the mature African male. Where the Constitutional Court is ambiguous with regard to gendered space, the Nkandla homestead is an affirmation of patriarchy and a statement of African architecture, questionable statement, a conscious armature of rural nostalgia bolstered with modern technology and amenities, complete with state-of-the-art medical facilities and infrastructure to support his extended household of several wives and over 30 documented children. I have 1 minute left, so I'm going to quickly skip over the bulk of the presentation and go to my conclusion. It's poetic that the fate of the one architectural project of the first citizen being Nkandla and its significance to the nation was determined in the spaces of another architectural space, the Constitutional Court, whose significance is uncontested and remains the supreme and final authority in all matters of state. It's poetic that a public building conceived through a competitive, ideas-based architectural project emerged and produced an ideological narrative and that sought to frame justice in stone, sits in opposition to a private architectural project masquerading as a public building whose ideological underpinnings have little to do with the diverse nature of publics it purports to serve, but as a state investment in a specific tribal imaginary. It is poetic to note that one of the core attributes of the African city is the desire to articulate a new African identity that is no longer dominated by the colonial gaze, but this often collapses into cultural nostalgia and circular tropes of being. These two projects represent two dialectic experiments in informing a post-apartheid conception of the city and public versus private architecture. They exemplify a tangible struggle for the identity of South Africa. This journey has not only cost South Africa millions in direct and social capital, but has precipitated several votes of no confidence in the president in the national parliament, and through the personage of the incumbent president, who is a central figure in this configuration, what is at stake is the nature of the republic itself, its priorities, and the deployment of architecture and architectural expression in the service of these priorities and adjacencies, and ultimately how cities are built. Can I please play the video? Need volume.
If they don't vote for him,
Volume.
he would never have been the president of South Africa.
But do you think Zuma is better than Malema is better than Zuma?
Zuma, if people didn't vote for him, Zuma will give those people money to vote for you.
What about Malema?
Malema is good.
You think so?
Yes.
And Jimbo, what do you think about
I think
Malema?
Malema is good because, I don't think that I think Malema is good because Zuma takes our tax money that we work hard to pay for and built a 246 million mansion with our tax money.
Where is that mentioned?
I don't think it's in Gauteng or between the border of Gauteng or KZN. It's called Nkandla.
Okay, do you know the place called Nkandla, Dimbo?
Yes.
Have you ever been there?
Nope.
So how do you know the place?
They show it on TV. But
I just heard the place is so nice. Is that true?
it's nice. It's big. You know, I don't think Zuma is intelligent. I think that here it doesn't work.
Inside his house, you have a gold toilet.
A gold toilet.
A golden toilet. And he buys it with our
Takes money. Hey, I like that one. I like.
You know,
A golden toilet.
I think Zuma is not intelligent because he builds the house. I expected it to be a double story, but when I look at it, it's just a rondavo.
It's not a double story.
I was just intrigued by the child who was critiquing the architectural language. Clearly, a rendezvous is totally inappropriate for that amount of capital. I thank you for your time.
You just have to touch. Just touch. Hi, everybody. I'm Jean-Charles Tan. I'm from Dakar, Senegal. I'm an architect, and as into the mic. Is it okay now? And as you said, I created a school of architecture in Dakar. You have to make sure that it works okay. When I was assigned the subject, mobility, I was like, are they crazy? I'm an architect. I build solid things, buildings that don't move. But then when I started writing about this, I found out that the questions that we have in mobility are exactly the same questions that we have in organizing space. It's all about organizing the city and what are the paradigms that you are using to build a city in Africa. So I put this very strange title, Efficiency of Informal and Informalization of the Formal. You will see with the presentation that the borders are very, very close. And I always start with the context. As an architect, as architects, we talk about context. So the idea is that Senegal is that very small place in Africa, and Dakar is that very small place inside Senegal. And this is a peninsula of 550 kilometers. That's 0.28% of the national territory. And we have 3 million persons. That's a quarter of the population on 0.28% of the territory. It's a peninsula, which means that the only direction of growth that you have for the city is the east, because north, west, and south, it's the sea. So just to remind you what we're talking about in terms of scale. But in this peninsula, you have 40% of civil servants, 97% of commercial jobs, 96% of banking sector employees, 95% of industries, et cetera, and 30% of irregular settlements. So that we all understand what we're talking about. But when we talk about displacement, mobility in Dakar, I would always want to start with mobility in the whole country. When you see the structure of the networks, here you have the roads. We could do that with the railroads. everything is concentrated towards Dakar because all that network of roads and railroads has been inherited from the colonial system, where the ports were the places where you would take the goods out of the colony. But when you get to a smaller scale, you will see that in Dakar, the main infrastructure, the main roads that has been designed in the last 10 years, designed or redesigned, we spent like 250 million CFA, which is roughly 250 billion, which is roughly $500 million on 3 main roads. You see the red one that we call the Corniche, the blue one that gets back to the red one, and the green that goes to the main and only entrance to Dakar. And when I started studying this, I found out that all the roads lead from the airport to the presidential palace. And those roads, that money was spent in 2010 or a little bit earlier for the Islamic Conference Organization Unit Summit. And, well, it explains. And then now, let's talk about informal, because I will not be, I'm not a good theorist. I want people to see what informal means. This was not a picture in Dakar. I took this picture in Lomé. And to me, informal is just doing things in a different way. This guy has to move bricks from one place to another. He doesn't have the money to rent a truck, but he has a bicycle. So he will not ride the bicycle. He will use the bicycle to move everything where it has to be moved. This is very important to understand what informal is in reality, not about the theory or whatever, but what real people do on a day-to-day basis. So you would see that one of the sectors that use informal systems a lot is the construction. You build a very important building, etc., and you will use horse carts to take your materials where they have to be taken. Again. And the idea is that we are using any means we need to achieve the goals. Here is the food industry. And of course, sometimes informality brings to very strange images. The car has been packed. There are no more seats inside. There is no more room for people standing. So people would be standing outside. 2 of them are employees of the bus. They take the money. And of course, in a very informal way, you don't have a ticket. And they don't have anything to write on. But when you get inside, they know where you're going, how much you're supposed to pay, how much of money you gave them, and how much they're supposed to give you back. And that can be on a trajectory of like 10 kilometers. Of course, things that normally, if you would do that, I guess if you do that in New York, you'll be in trouble with the police. So by any means necessary, that's informality on a day-to-day basis. Of course, you don't have room inside. People will just sit on the top. The important thing is that we get to the place that we want to get to. So I usually use this thing to understand the differences, because in all the literature, you have an opposition between informal and formal. First of all, to me, informality is an answer to necessity. People have things to do in the city, and nobody gives them the means to do that. transport is too expensive. They don't have the right to go on certain roads, etc., etc. Opposed to what we call normal, formal, standardized, which refers most of the time to a type of economy that is official economy and that does not fulfill the needs of the majority of the people. Informality has got its own codes. There's always this mistake that people say it's chaotic. It's not chaotic. I mean, chaos is not disorder. It's just another way of organizing the city. When you see those people, the vendors out in the street, you just cannot come with your goods and sit down wherever you want to sit and try to sell something. They will come and tell you, no, this part of the street is my place. I'm not supposed to sit here. So there are codes. But those codes are different from those that we train people use as official codes. There's one philosophy that is achieving the goals by all means necessary. And opposed to that is that vision of the society where the society has to be organized and use what we call modernity. This morning we've been talking a lot about modernity. And I think that the difference between formal and informal is at the heart of this debate about modernity. Formal, individual cars, informal, pedestrian, because pedestrians are not taken into account in our mobility policies. I remember I told you that we spent 500 million on roads. Those roads, of course, make life easier for those people who have cars, but 80% of the mobility in Dakar is pedestrian. And there is not one single infrastructure that was designed for those people. And that's tax money. Then you see bicycle, motorbikes. I was wondering, where am I going to put that? Of course, you need a license, which is formal. But then most of the people are using the bicycles a way that is not very formal. Most of them do not have helmets, which is compulsory, but they decided that helmets are too expensive. So they're just not using helmets. Then we've got this crazy thing in Dakar, is the taxi drivers, yellow and black. And then you have informal taxis that we call clandestine taxis. But it's very strange because they're clandestine, but they pay a tax every day. They pay a tax to the municipality. So somebody knows that they exist. How clandestine are they? And then we have what we call car rapide and Jaganyai. Those are the popular means of transport. These people have a driving license. They have a license to drive those particular buses. They have routes that normally they're supposed to stick to. And those are the most informal people in our city. Because if they see that they won't get enough clients on their routes, they'll just decide to take another one. And this informality is nourished by the corruption of the police. I mean, the guy, you saw those people outside hanging on the bus. If they are stopped by a policeman, it will cost 500 CFA, which is a little bit less than $1 that they give to the policeman. And then we have official bus, comparing to nothing. That's the national company named Dakar Demdik. Those buses were blue from 2000 to 2012. Because at that time, the president of Senegal was Abdoulaye Wade, and the colors of his party was blue. Now the color of the ruling party is brown. And they took exactly the same colors to put on all the buses. That's formal, but not really Republican. And if it's not Republican, maybe it's not really formal. Then, of course, horse carts, and they will compete with the trucks to move the goods. Of course, there are cities where they are used for the transportation of people. The city of Professor Diouf, Rufisque, where they have those beautiful, beautiful carts. And then when you try to deal with formal and informal, you have all this and you don't know where the border is between those two systems. And of course, the people of the informal system, when you tell them or you make too much disorder, they will complain that the formal system is not exempt from problems. This is a formal company using the track in a very informal way. This track had just been repaired by a very formal company, and then I just ran into this very strange situation. And they will tell you, okay, you've got plates for your cars? Well, we've got plates for our cars. And in some cities, those are very official plates. But the interesting thing is that most of the time they look for the image of formalism. So in a city like Dakar, they will just, this plate doesn't mean anything. They will just get a plate and put it on, period. And of course, when I pay the toll on a highway, am I informal? I don't think that you would see that on highways in the United States. But where is the border? So I always say it's a very thin line between informal and official. Of course, formal problems, formal system, I've been talking about those roads that were designed with the head of the company that was in charge of that design was the son of the former president. And the president declared that he trusted his son because he was the most intelligent of all Senegalese economists. Now he's in jail. I'm very sorry for him, but not for our tax money. So they designed this, and you see, you have the bridge. But 90% of the people do not use the bridge. So my question is, of course, we are technicians. We have been trained that you don't cross a speedway, a highway, you have to go on the bridge, etc., etc. But when we designed this, did we question the practice of the people? How do the people use those bridges? And we have come to a very strange situation where a taxi driver that was caught in a traffic jam used the ramps of the bridge, which is a pedestrian bridge, to get on the other way and try to find a way out. Unfortunately for him, somebody took the picture of the plate, and the guy is in prison right now. Of course, you see very strange things happening. Yeah. And that's another story where there's a traffic jam, and people just turn around on the highway. And of course, the formal system would create problems. Those were the floods in 2005, where they designed all those roads. Unfortunately for them, 1 month after they finished the roads, there was huge rains, and all the neighborhoods were completely overflowed. So questions, and maybe I'll finish with this. When we want to understand formal, informal, there's one question that is essential, that who is defining the public policies? And who are we defining those policies for? I think this question came about this morning. What is the basis of all this? Who is taking advantage of the policies that we're designing? Who is taking advantage of the fact that we've got formal informal, and what are the cultural models that are at stake. One thing in our countries, and I see that on all the presentations, one of our huge problems is the definition of modernity itself. What is modern? In our country, it has always been defined as an opposition to tradition. And just, I think in your presentation, you said you did not like the word, but used tradition. And tradition has always been downgraded by the colonial power and by the elite that took power after independence. So there is no questioning, no real questioning about what is modern. And I found out just that what is modern in our situation is just the image of modernity that we have. We look like. President Senghor, our first president who was a poet, used to say that in year 2000, Dakar will be like Paris. We always try to look like the image that we have. And the result of the image is that we spent a lot of money, but we did not improve the situation of mobility in Dakar, etc., etc. And then the last point is that when you question mobility, in Senegal, you question the control of space. Trains have always facilitated mobility in the big cities. In Dakar, this is the old railway station that was built in 1886. It's completely abandoned right now because the former president had this idea of doing huge project that was called the presidential projects. And they built that theater. They called the Grand Theater, Chinese technology, Chinese company, Chinese architect, Chinese workers, in the context of Senegal. And the president that we have today built this huge museum, and now the director general of the museum is trying desperately to find something to put inside the museum. And this is the image. Unfortunately, the image is not very good. That's a poster from the presidents of the Republic. And this is what they did on the site of the main taxi station in Dakar. They just relocated it in the suburbs, so that now if you want to go to the city of Thiès, which is 70 kilometers from Dakar, you have to pay your taxi inside Dakar, 3,000 to get to this place, and pay another 3,000 to get to the city where you want to go. But again, the question is about our vision on our society. And I think all the panels this morning show that the very important question that we have to address is who is defining our city? Who is defining our society? And who is defining our future? Thank you very much. I've got other things, but
Thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk. I spent 6 years between 2008 and 2014 working on a project in this building, Ponty City in central Johannesburg, with the British artist and my colleague Patrick Waterhouse. We're interested in Ponty City both because it has this incredible physical structure that, as you can see, literally dominates the Johannesburg skyline, but also because of the way that the building, in a metaphorical way, becomes a crucible for Johannesburg's imaginations about itself, the way the city tells stories about its own history and its own future. So what did we do for 6 years? We basically collected documents and collected stories. The documents were in the form of photographs and found documents and historical documents. And these documents, of course, like all documents, contain many fictions. And the stories, many of them fictional, often tell a kind of more accurate, quote-unquote, accurate story of quote-unquote the reality of the building. So in the project, we try and express this real interplay between what is a document and what is a fictional. A lot of both the documents and the fictions deal with mobility, different forms of mobility. The movement, on one level, the movement of people from rural areas in South Africa and the rest of the African continent to Johannesburg, which 100 years and 100 and something years after its founding is still really a frontier town where people come to seek their fortune. And that, of course, is another form of mobility, social mobility, the kind of fiction of mobility, as well as the mobility of the gaze, the gaze looking at the building, the gaze looking from the building, and of course, as artists and photographers, our gaze and how we engage with the people that we photograph. Very quickly, a history of the building. It was completed in 1976, a very kind of auspicious year, of course, in South African history. And this is advertisement from that year, which pictures the building towards young, aspirant, upwardly mobile young people, white only young, upwardly mobile people. And I've been fascinated, especially in this image, how it expresses this kind of confluence between two impossible dreams. The impossible dream of modernism, whereby you have that it's even would be possible to have the self-contained city in the sky filled with shops and apartments and amenities that you never have to leave the one building. And of course, the impossible dream of apartheid, that an area like this, Hillbrow and Berea, could be reserved exclusively for one race of people. Very quickly, Ponty City, very quickly after its opening, Ponty City and the area that it's in changed. In the 80s, Berea and Hillbrow became one of the first areas to mix racially to what was known as a grey area. And then in the late 80s and 90s, in the so-called decline of inner city Johannesburg, the building, Ponty City, became a kind of exaggerated example of the slumification of the central Johannesburg. It was known for stories of Nigerian drug dealers and prostitution and evictions, and all the worst things that the people imagined about the city were projected in particular onto this building. In 2007, it was bought by developers who, in advance of the World Cup, the Football World Cup, they wanted to turn it into kind of chic New York-style inner-city living. And again, this is a real advertisement which pitches the building towards young, upwardly mobile, aspirant people, but of course a very different demographic in 2007 and 2008. After the financial crisis of 2008, those developers disappeared and the whole scheme fell apart. They'd emptied half the building and started renovating it, and the building went back to its old owners, and that impossible dream of turning it into this kind of new form of aspiration building itself fell apart. So this is the building, and it was during that period when this development was taking place and then not taking place that me and Patrick started working. We started working very much by looking at the physical structure, and the best way we thought we could do that was to remove the concrete and look at the apertures. So we took a photograph of every window in the building. There you can see them arranged in a large light box, completely accurate to the building, floor by floor, 33 on top of 32, etc., and horizontally, flat by flat. And as we zoom in on this image, you can see how people's lives interfere with that kind of the modernist structure, the perfect grid. People put curtains up, some people wanted to be in the photographs, and we were really drawn to what it meant to look outwards from this building. So much of the fantasy of Johannesburg as this dangerous inner city, the so-called dangerous inner city of Johannesburg comes from looking at this building and looking at it and imagining how bad it could be. And so we were looking from it away to the point where we zoom in and we see one man looking out of the windows. This was a bit of an anomaly because the majority of people had covered up their windows and were not looking at the view, they were looking at their television screens. So this became our second typology. Of course, the metaphor is obvious, the alternative window out of the building, where The variety of what people were watching in these alternative windows fascinated us, from Nollywood movies to Congolese sitcoms to Hollywood movies. And Ponty City, when we were working there, was a very safe space. You know, we never had any problems working there. But all the stories, all the fictions of the building, the kind of stories of drug lords and gangsters and shootouts and prostitutes were there fictionally on the television screens. Our third typology is the internal doors to each apartment. And we would knock on those doors at night over a period of 2 years. And if somebody wanted to have a portrait taken of them, we'd take their portrait. If not, we'd photograph the surface of their doors. And of course, those surfaces tell a fascinating story of the history of the building. I really often think of this typology of the doors as a kind of archaeology of Ponty City, where when we look at the whole building, you can see the different stages of its history. The developers in 2008 started in the bottom half of the building and put these blue lights on top of black doors. And then after they went bankrupt, many of those blue lights were taken out. They left people living in the top half of the building, and those red doors that you see there are from the original doors from the 1970s. We worked our way down the building from the top to the bottom, and right at the bottom on the very last floor we found these doors to what used to be the public restrooms. And quite remarkably, in 2010 they still had the ultimate signifiers of apartheid: European ladies' diamonds and European gents' here. Public bathrooms reserved for white people only, or Europeans, that in 2010 had not yet been painted over, and really did feel like this archaeological find. These exclusions of the movement of people had been inscribed on the very walls of the building and somehow forgotten there until we found them by digging into this archaeology. To end with, I'd like to kind of jump into one of the apartments that was documented in the images you saw before. It was an apartment that had been abandoned, and when people moved out to make space for the developers, for reasons that I still don't understand, they must have moved out in a hurry, and they often left very personal documents and possessions, which were then kind of ransacked by either the construction crews or by thieves. And so on the floors of these apartments that had been abandoned, it was just covered in rubbish, and these personal documents were kind of strewn on the floor amongst the rubbish. So this is a portrait of a man that we found, a man I never met. And this portrait was in amongst another stack of documents. This is a map which describes that man and his cousin's journey from the Congo, from Goma to Bukavu, to Uvila, to Maputo, to Zambia, to Zimbabwe, and to South Africa. And of course, these appear to be primary sources. These appear to be very kind of real documents that tell a story. But in putting them together, me and Patrick were creating a fiction because we had no real knowledge of what the relationship between them was. We were assuming these relationships and thereby creating our own fantasy of what this journey had been. Perhaps that man traveled on a bus like this. This is a letter that he wrote to the South African Human Rights Commission, where he was appealing for asylum in South Africa, which describes in very kind of graphic detail the journey from the Congo to South Africa and the very difficult experiences of his family in the Congo. Attached to the same stack of documents was this other part of the Human Rights submission, a Human Rights Commission submission, where he talks about working as a security guard in Johannesburg, and a terrible incident where a racist man kind of described him as a monkey, and when he objected to this man pulled out a gun and shot at him. And for me, this was just such an incredible image of how Johannesburg, as this described as a frontier town, pulls people magnetically towards it and then spits them out. And Ponty City, right at the center of this frontier town, often is the building to which they come. And finally, at the bottom of the stack of documents was perhaps the saddest document of all, this refusal letter from the Australian High Commission. So after that spitting out of Johannesburg, this man was refused the ability to go somewhere else where he wanted to go. Also amongst these documents, all from the same apartment, was this certificate. And I've read a number of accounts by anthropologists particularly about qualifications that people carry with them from other parts of Africa to South Africa, and of how these are often fictional documents. But it's very interesting that the very functional reason why those fictions are created. And I have no idea if this is a real or a fictional document. Of course, those boundaries are porous. But whether it is real or fictional, it fascinates me that this person, either in reality or in his imagination, studied the stars, the sun, small bodies, the terrestrial planets, the Earth-Moon system, orbits in the solar system, the dynamics of the Earth, the Jovian planets and Pluto, orbits outside the solar system, celestial mechanics, and the solar system. And that, for me, just gives such a picture of scale, and the scale of movement, both in the movement of people's actual bodies and in the movement of their imaginations, in telling stories, in making stories, and imagining their place in the world. And all of this was from the experience of going to one building repeatedly for 6 years. Thank you very much.
I'm going to invite our speakers to the table so that we can join conversation, and we're going to be led in that by Clara Irazabel, who is a professor here in the urban planning part of GSAPP. So if you can take your seats, great, and then we'll open up for conversation.
Thank you very much to all the speakers for such provocative talks and images and metaphors. And thank you also to Empo and Mabel and Mario for putting together this interesting conference, and also to invite me to be part of it. Or rather, I don't know if I should thank you for it, because I would agree with what Mark Wigley said this morning. This is an impossible task, trying to make sense and synthesize so many different approaches to tools that we might use to rethink, reimagine the African cities, and with them all cities actually around the world, and to try to make that on the spot, because I wasn't aware of your presentations before just now. But I have some thoughts that perhaps can add to the mixing. And I would like perhaps to start with Rosalind's comments, introductory comment. She referred to a double displacement that is perhaps the one that is structuring this particular panel and perhaps the entire conference. Let me first recognize my own displacements, if you wished, here. I'm not a practicing architect or an architectural scholar. I consider myself better situated in urban planning, which is one of the programs that we have here in the school. And I consider myself an expert, and that's the contribution that I've been doing in the school, in Latin American cities as opposed to African cities. But I think we can certainly have a very productive dialogue between these two continents. The double displacement that Rosalind was speaking about was first about the capital city or the city of capital. And it seems to me that perhaps even through the images that we saw here of the capitals, of the African cities, that Margaret Thatcher may have won, after all, when she said, there is no alternative. Tina, right? Are we all capitalist cities in the world today? And can we really avoid being that? But I think Rosalind was also speaking about the importance of scales, spatial scales, looking from the local to the regional, to the national, to the global. And particularly, I think that within cities, including African cities, just as in the last projects that we saw, for example, we can see that there exist subversions of this capitalist order that can give us hope and guidance on how we see that we can break that there is no alternative imaginary to summon other types of presents and futures. I'm particularly, I was to evoke the experience that my students and I just had in Brazil, where we visited occupations, buildings and land occupations in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, done in a very politicized and organized manner by several social movements there, among them the Movimento dos Trabalhadores Sem Teto, the movement of the workers without roof or roofless workers, and how we see that they are indeed challenging in fundamental ways, but in many occasions also successful ways, the capitalist city, because they actually put the government and real estate investors and developers to negotiate with them, and having the process accomplished very interesting social housing projects. The second displacement is that of the concept of mobility, and I think in here Rosalind is inviting us to consider temporal scales. The importance of analyzing cities today through connections with the past. She talked about ancestors, the way they lived and conceived and built our cities, and connections to the futures in plural that have been invoked several times during the conference today through science fiction, through different genres of art, but also evidently architecture as well. In my own work, I came about the concept of trans-bordering planning to signal that now we need to look at scales and the mobility across scales, both spatial and temporal, to mean also movements that transcend those that are physical. We have national boundaries that we cross, or the ones that are privileged enough to cross. We have sometimes city boundaries, such as in the case of Jerusalem, but it's not the only city in the world that has such walled, very explicit boundaries between neighborhoods. We have continental boundaries that also restrict mobility at the moment, such as for Europe in the current refugee crisis, and things like that. But we also have cultural borders, language borders, borders that come about because of gender and sexual orientation and English proficiency or English accent and nationality, and you name it. And I think those also either hinder or favor different types of mobilities that ultimately have some important bearings in the constructions and reconstructions of cities today. One thing that perhaps wasn't explicitly mentioned that I think is important to bring to the table is the contribution of the internet and information and communication technologies and social media in creating and nurturing different types of mobilities in the world, including the ones that are very visibly transforming our cities. I'm thinking about, again, the mobilization of social movements that is supported by social media, and therefore the movements can act and transform the cities. I'm thinking about virtual communities that do not need physical propinquity anymore to exist, to build social fields that transcend physical or spatial boundaries. And new business opportunities, particularly in the context of Africa. I'm aware that the use of cell phones, for example, have opened up opportunities for small entrepreneurs and has been particularly helpful to women, opening up their small businesses and the sort, and expanding the catch areas for such businesses. And this brings me also to the idea of the importance of discussing more explicitly also the topic of gender gender roles, and particularly the role of women in the transformation of African cities today. I would have hoped to see more Africanist women doing presentations in our panels today. So something for the second iteration, perhaps, of this conference. Mokena, I'm really intrigued by your decision not to show us images of these two buildings that you were talking about, and unfortunately I haven't been privileged to see them before, so it was hard for me to imagine them, but I was intrigued about this requirement of the competition that brought about, I think, the Constitutional Court that said that the architecture neither could represent any group, any ethnic group in the country, nor create a pastiche that represented them all. And I'm wondering, as a question, if architecture can indeed be so mute. And I was eager to see an image of the building to see if they really got to that request, and in that manner they thought they did. And if they were indeed so mute in the expression of architecture, I'm wondering if silence is not a very powerful language, speech figure that we also need to deconstruct as part of the text. John Charles brings us many examples and attention to the importance of informality in the construction of not only African cities, I would say, but all cities around the world. Informality is very present here in New York, in the way people are overcrowding apartments, subdividing them in illegal ways, but also using jitneys, which are these so-called illegal taxis or illegal buses. They have a very important presence in New York and in New Jersey, and they serve routes. They have the flexibility that you mentioned, informality can afford, and in that sense cover routes that are not covered by the formal public transit. Making do, doing in the way you can through informality, using the degrees of freedoms that are afforded to you or through creativity, the ones that you open as well, is a very important feature of all cities in the world today, so much so that there is a rapidly growing planning literature on the topic. Some of the most important representatives perhaps are Ananya Roy, Nima Kudva, but we also see it in the African literature for cities, particularly by Abdo Malik Simon and Edgar Pieterse, that is here today with us. I also wanted to mention the importance of changing the paradigm of transportation planning, which has been happening in the field of planning in recent years. It was called, the subfield of planning was called transportation planning, and a lot more people are calling it now mobilities, in the understanding of all these different types of mobilities that do not refer to wheeled mobilities, and particularly to private automobiles, right? Which is what we conceive of most frequently when we talk about transportation planning. But even more recently, people are talking about not about mobilities, but about accessibility. Going back to the traditional ways of building our cities, both in the African and the Latin American context, in which in your neighborhood you had walking access to shops and schools and recreational facilities and churches or temples and anything you really needed. So if you can afford to walk to the places that you need in your daily, weekly living, then you don't need public transportation, fancy equipments that are costly and things like that. So the more that we can accomplish accessibility, the less reliance we would need to have in public transportation. And then, Michael, the mobility of the gaze, looking into African cities, looking out from African cities, and looking within and across African cities, I think is very important for the problematizing of the notions of, or the understanding of cities today, but also the conception of how can we move forward. And your example in Johannesburg made me think about one in Venezuela, my birth country, that you perhaps have heard about or seen, Torre David, the David's Tower. There are documentaries about it. Even the Homeland TV series had an episode in Torre David in which it was presented as a haven for terrorists and drug traffickers, and as the symbol of Venezuela. In the same manner that you were referring to your tower, the tensions that exist between the realities of these architectural projects and the ways that they are appropriated by the people, and the virtual realities or the imaginaries that are created for them, for the purposes of servicing usually elite groups, are of enormous importance to be examined, and I welcome that opportunity. Thank you.
Is this the total time we have for the session? Yeah. Okay, let us take gather some questions together, and then we'll give our speakers an opportunity to respond to both the commentary here and perhaps to each other. If there aren't questions, I will ask them to speak, or I'll give them the opportunity to speak now. And it looks like you're still gathering them, so Mokena, do you want to respond, and we'll work in reverse order as...
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks to my colleagues for a very inspiring set of presentations, which resonated with a lot of what I thought about and actually wanted to say, but I didn't have the time to say. I think your observation about me not privileging the I in the presentation was actually quite intentional. I ran out of time, but I had a series of slides which I would have shared after I had spoken. And the reason being that I'll quote one of the architects who won on the competition, and she said, the building design was not about style, but a value system enshrined in the Bill of Rights and the response to physical aspects of the site. Now, why I say this is that as scholars and producers of architecture, and particularly African architecture, we've often grappled, whether as students or as professionals, with how do we actually begin to define this thing? What is its shape? What is its form? Is it something that we can ascribe to? Your presentation was quite wonderful because you visually challenged us in terms of what is formal or informal, and likewise your mapping of the sort of artifacts on the site reveal a very particular sensibility about how do we read things. And I think when we talk about the African city, it's so easy to privilege what things look like, as opposed to understanding how things work and how they operate. The ability to understand that form needs to transcend form, and that the nature of an African architecture sometimes is formless, because it's in its operation that a different sensibility begins to emerge. So yes, I could have done a whole presentation with planned section elevations and described the building and showed you, but I think that would have taken away the deeper lesson, which is to say that the Constitutional Court privileges a production and a social mode of practice to which the aesthetics is not primary, but it is incidental. The problem with Nkandla privileges a very particular male chauvinist, dare I say it, tribal representation of what authority is, and therefore fails in its operation because it's preoccupied with its physical form. And I think as architects and spatial practitioners, yes, we manipulate and craft form all the time, but I do think that we have to be careful that the form doesn't become both the objective, the process, and the product of what we do, because the making of the African city has to transcend morphological considerations. It has to become something far much more deeper and complex, because our cities transcend the problem of form, if that makes sense, yeah, for me.
Yeah, maybe I'll start with this, the last one, because what we notice in West Africa, especially, is that
speak a little closer into the microphone, please.
Is that unfortunately the form still is the most determinant pattern for the elite and for the deciding people. You've been talking about double displacement. There has been, first of all, a displacement in history. You remember you were listing some cities, and I was like, is she going to talk about Kumbi Saleh or Timbuktu or whatever? When I was a child, we were taught French, like trying to create phrases. So you had a list of qualities, and that would refer to a certain place. So for the village, you had dark, dirty, etc., etc., which is a complete nonsense. It's a phantasm of the colonizer. Our villages have never been dirty, because you are supposed to clean the sand in front of your house up to the middle of the street, and the other person does the same thing. President Sankara in Burkina Faso tried to rehabilitate them. But you had all those things, and then you had the city, and the city was modern, developed, etc., etc. So the trick is that we are caught in that definition of modernity, where modernity appears to be like, I would use the word of this young economist, a theology. Like all societies are supposed to be moving in history on the same way, and the final goal is to be developed. I just show a picture of the book. All people working on Africa should read that book from Felwine Sarr. He's a young economist, a professor of economy in Saint Louis, and he talks about this type of modernity. We are caught into that. That's the reason why the colonizers made into our minds that urbanism, the urban phenomenon, does not exist in Africa, which is not true. Timbuktu was a very, very highly sophisticated civilization. The libraries of Sankore had thousands and thousands of books back in the 12th and 13th century. But now, what is considered as urban phenomena in Africa, well, all those cities have been wiped out. And to me, that's the first displacement of our way of thinking about ourselves. And this is the reason why it's very important that we re-question what modernity is. We re-question what we want to be. And we should start that by re-questioning who we are. My theory is that I will not bother if somebody defines me as. The most important is I have to be aware who I am. Some of my friends tell me, well, you're not really African. You're not dressed really African. What does it mean? Well, I speak English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and our national languages. So what defines me? So first step for our elite is to make sure that their mind is very clear about who they are. And if we don't do that, we are caught in this modernity thing where Dakar should be like Paris, and then Dakar and Abidjan were competing, who is going to be the... And then we miss the important things. Somebody this morning showed the fair in Dakar, you know, with these triangular buildings. That's very important. And then we had that brother from Angola who showed the Chokwe Soma design. Those are very highly sophisticated mathematics. And we've been told that Africa does not have science. I know somebody right now who is researching the quantum physics principles that are embedded in African tales. It's just the form of transmission of knowledge that is different. So it's very important that we restart from everything. And that's the reason why I'm very happy to, when you talk about changing the paradigm, it's very important. If we don't do that, well, let's forget.
I want to say thank you, Clara, for your responses, and I think you brought three very important things to the table that perhaps was kind of in the background of all of our presentations, but not specifically mentioned, and that, of course, is technology and gender and privilege. And I just want to very briefly pick up on the last, where you ended off with privilege. Of course, privilege manifests in so many forms. In relation to my presentation, there's the privilege of capital, which was really shaping the story throughout of this building, in how and why it was built in the first place, who it was built for. In 2008, you know, the greed of bankers on this side of the world had, of course, repercussions all over the world, but very specific repercussions for the lives of these people living in this building in Johannesburg. And then the gays, and there's unfortunately not enough time to really dig into that, and I'd love to engage Rosalind as well, in relation to the privilege of the gays. The privilege of looking, of course, as a photographer, that's something I have to think about all of the time. But I think privilege also operates in unexpected ways in relation to the making of representations and the telling of stories. And for me, it was a privilege to collapse some of the fictions about that building. People in Johannesburg still think, people in some parts of Johannesburg still think I'm crazy to have gone to that building, because they still think they still believe the fiction. They kind of they're attached to the fiction of it being this dangerous place. So for me, going there and looking out from within was really a privilege to view that perspective and to collapse that fiction. So I want to thank you for that.
Are there questions in the audience that you would like to put to our panelists? Yes. There's a mic coming to you. Just a second.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation and projects. Actually, I have a question for Michael, which you sort of addressed right now in your response to
Can you
what
speak,
respondents.
Natasha,
So,
can you speak?
oh, okay. So, yeah, I was wondering, actually, both me and my friend here were wondering, the choice to not include maybe like a trace of yourself visually, a hand or you or your partner, to sort of have a trace of yourself and in relation to the gays that you just mentioned and the privilege of the gays, to open up a conversation about your own accessibility to the space that is Ponte City. So visually, if you can sort of address that. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I would argue that every photograph has a trace of the author. I don't believe that there is such a thing as being in a space as a fly on the wall as a photographer and photographing something as it happens in reality. I think a photograph is always a function of a relationship, of an engagement. And not particularly in this project, but that's something that I've been quite obsessed with in the last 5 years. I started off my practice very much in the tradition of documentary photography. And then as my practice has developed, I've kind of had to engage the deep ambivalences that I have about the process of making photographic representations. And that comes into, in particular, a body of work that I did called Retinal Shift. So unfortunately, I can't really get into that and show you how I've engaged with that. But within Ponte City, I think there's perhaps a more subtle acknowledgement of my presence as an author. And we made a book, Patrick and myself, and kind of hidden in that book are glimpses of ourselves. So I agree with completely with the question. I appreciate the question, and I think it's really important to engage that. But like I say, I think it's always there implicitly in the making of photographic representations.
I think as we come to a close here, I'm struck suddenly as in relationship to this question and your response about the through line actually across these very, very different papers, the through line vis-a-vis the question of the image. I mean, your work of course has that as its overt thematic and mediatic dimension. But, Jean-Charles, as you were speaking to us about that aspiration to appear in the image of modernity, and to do so via these signs, the simulated license plate, and all the myriad performances of modernity that nonetheless cover over both gaps and violences that in the demand for that performance. And in your own talk, Mokena, your own iconoclasm in the form of your presentation, but you closed with that remarkable video in which everything resists the production of that video, from the light to the child's awkwardness, but his incredible articulateness and his literacy, his architectural literacy, and his knowledge that he can speak to that audience vis-a-vis a form of appearance that will be recognized both as a signifier of tradition and as a signifier of corruption. It is quite remarkable, and so it gives us, I think, to take forward another set of questions beyond those of what is the city and what is mobility vis-a-vis movement, coerced or otherwise, but also some thinking of the image and the more general question of forms of appearance of modernity. So I think we can maybe close with that and move to a break and then the next panel, yeah? Thank you so much, all three of you. Thank you, Clara.